Hello, Brovs. We're back with Triad, a novel of the supernatural. Chapter 2 was much more reassuring than Chapter 1, which came off as a rather romantic romance novel, but Chapter 2 was much better. Chapter 3, it happened when I was 9 and Rhiannon, a ripening 13. Every summer I spent several weeks at my relative's farm in southwestern Wisconsin, and my cousin Rhiannon would return the visit to us in the city later in the summer. Our parents wanted us to grow up like sisters, but they failed to take into consideration the difference in our ages and temperaments. Our features were strikingly identical, and we had the same pale blonde hair, but there the resemblance ended. My cousin was about as much to my liking as castor oil. She was a born homemaker. People always said a model child. Aunt Megan bragged that Rhiannon could make her own bed when she was only 4, and it was true that she kept her room in meticulous order and won all the baking and sewing ribbons in the 4-H exhibit at the county fair. In school, Rhiannon was a genius in mathematics, my hardest subject, although I suspect she didn't do very well in reading, as Aunt Megan never talked about that. Besides, I never saw my cousin pick up a book voluntarily outside of a movie magazine, and her spelling was, to say the least, unique. Domestically inclined as she was, Rhiannon was also an expert equestrian. She had learned to ride when she was barely able to toddle, and later Uncle Peter brought her a swift and spirited white mare, which she rode bareback. City bred, I never got over my need for a saddle, and I always felt awkward on Pryderi, the Welsh pony that Rhiannon had outgrown. Only by the most insistent urging could this fat and senior citizen be coaxed out of his ragged dog trot. So there I'd be, flapping the reins and clucking my tongue, while Rhiannon, her long hair streaming in the wind, her body and the mare's fused into one, would be rocketing across the meadows, hurdling hedges and fences, and then circling back to jeer at my clumsiness. Once, as I gazed in horror, she dove her horse off a high bank into a spring-fed quarry. I was sure, as I watched the water close over their heads, that they would both be drowned, but in a moment they emerged, the mare swimming smoothly, and Rhiannon, her hair gleaming like wet pearl, triumphantly astride. Naturally, I had to try it too. I turned my Pegasus in the direction of the quarry, digging my heels into his chubby sides and closing my eyes tight. But instead of plunging into the abyss as I had expected, I was catapulted backward onto the hard ground as Praderi reared in terror. I learned later, while Aunt Megan simultaneously scolded me and treated my bruises, that the pony had always had an abnormal fear of water. I warned her, Rhiannon lied blandly as she watched her mother apply the smarting disinfectant to my wounds. But Branwen, she never listens. I knew she was hoping I'd cry out when the medicine stung me, but that was one pleasure I stubbornly denied her. My mother, who wanted me to be just as accomplished as my cousin, was always holding Rhiannon up to me as a paragon. Rhiannon never scuffs her shoes. Rhiannon sews beautifully. Rhiannon doesn't come in with torn clothes. Rhiannon never has untidy hair. Rhiannon's room is always neat and clean, not like your pigsty. Rhiannon knows how to organize her time. She not only takes prizes at the county fair for her needlework, she wins ribbons in the horse show. Rhiannon, Rhiannon, Rhiannon. I choked on the name. My aunt's weekly letter to my mother was a dread, inevitably, as it always meant more admonishments. It never occurred to me that my mother did her own share of boasting. She didn't believe in praising her own child to her face. But I didn't know that then, and I grew up thinking that everyone admired Rhiannon because she was efficient, organized, and well coordinated, while I was heedless, untidy, awkward, and my mother and father's love, obviously, mere obligation. But I knew Rhiannon the others didn't, one who secretly pinched me and pulled my hair. A Rhiannon who always found innumerable sly ways to torment me and rouse me to strike back openly so that I'd be punished for fighting. The older we grew, the cleverer at it she became. If it was my turn to mop the floor, she would shove dust under the rugs after I'd finished and then call Mother or Aunt Megan and tell them that was where I put my moppings. Once she tripped me when I was carrying some of my mother's best dishes, but by the time Mother got there, Rhiannon had disappeared, and no one would believe I hadn't been careless. Another time, she deliberately smashed my best doll, the precious bisque one that had been my mother's when she was little, and when I was caught tearfully picking up the pieces, I got the blame. I was too young to realize then that some of her resentment may have stemmed from the fact that I upstaged her by arriving 4 years later than she did. She had been used to all the attention from aunt, uncle, and grandparents alike. Then suddenly, I was the family novelty, and when she developed into a gangling, gap-toothed preteener, I was still in the cute stage. Aunt Megan probably felt I had stolen the limelight from her darling, too, and that may account for her defensiveness. Actually, by the time of that terrible summer, the tables had begun to be reversed, for Rhiannon was developing the little grace of maidenhood, while I was well into the awkward years. That last vacation on the farm started out happily. As soon as they brought me back from the bus station, Uncle Peter went out to the barn and returned with the tiny ball of golden fluff, which he deposited in my eager hands. It was the only survivor of their cat's last batch, and Uncle Peter said he wanted me to have it. This was the first time I had ever owned anything alive, something that moved and breathed and had a life independent of my imagination. It was all warmth and purring silk as it lay in my hands and gently investigated my cheek. You mean it's mine for when I'm here? I asked. It's yours permanently, Uncle Peter amended. We asked your parents and they said it would be all right for you to bring it home. Oh, Uncle Peter, I cried, slipping one arm around his neck and giving him a big hug. Thank you, thank you. I kissed him and Aunt Megan and then turned back to the kitten adoringly. But as I did, a sensation of coldness enveloping me caused me to look up. Rhiannon's eyes were glittering green slits. She wanted it for herself, or at least she did after she knew Uncle Peter was giving it to me. I held the kitten out to her. I love it, I said, but maybe you wanted it, Rhiannon. Oh, no, she said smoothly. Our cat can have more. I want you to have it, really, I do. That's my unselfish girl. Aunt Megan's gaunt face was suffused with pride. Just you try to be like her, Branwyn. Now, Meg, Uncle Peter protested, picking up his farm bureau newspaper from the table and heading for his big chair. Don't you start bragging about your daughter again. You'll have her swell-headed first thing. I like Branwyn just as she is. This family has enough twins. A little individuality is a good thing. Rhiannon's look was venomous. Oh, there's enough individuality among us, Aunt Megan sniffed. Before we married, you couldn't tell Olwen and me apart. You remember, we used to switch dates on you and Pat, and you'd never know it. Uncle Peter chuckled slyly. That's nothing, he said. We did the same thing to you. She leaned across the table, one scrawny arm akimbo. You think we didn't know it? It's surprising we ever got ourselves unscrambled for the wedding so that the right pairs got hitched. In fact, I sometimes wonder if we really did, but that's something none of us will ever know. You have a college degree like your brother, but did you make use of it? No. You stayed on to manage your folks' farm, and when they died, we just naturally took over. So now look at us. My sister's a fashion plate. Me, I'm a dowdy old hen with graying hair and a frizzy permanent, while next to your brother you look like a migrant worker. It was an old argument, but Uncle Peter didn't get to make his usual reply because they both were distracted by Rhiannon, who had gone red in the face and was bobbing up and down convulsively, arms clutched across her chest. "Oh dear," my aunt fussed. "I hope you're not going to have another one of your asthma attacks, darling." Rhiannon nodded, her coughing working up into spasms, then into harsh, sibilant wheezes that made her sound like a winded horse. I suppose I should have been just as concerned as my aunt and uncle, but it had long been apparent to me that she always had these attacks when things weren't going her way. Aunt Megan rushed out of the room to get her medicine, while Uncle Peter stood by, putting her on the back ineffectually. It was amazing how she could galvanize the attention of her parents with this device. I knew that once she succeeded in making her point, her wheezes would subside, and that they did after my uncle took her into his lap and began stroking her hair and forehead. Although she managed a few hacks for show when Aunt Megan came back with the pills. After swallowing one, she lay there, her arms around her father's neck, her face still flushed and sweaty, and her eyes as changeable as lake water, glinting at me triumphantly. It was obvious to me, at least, that Rhiannon resented any show of affection toward me by her father. To me, Uncle Peter was special. Maybe Aunt Megan was piqued because my father earned his living as a glass-topped desk. But I thought Uncle Peter had the better of it out here on the farm, where he could smell the earth and watch the things he'd planted grow and be fruitful. I used to follow him everywhere, around the barnyard as he did his chores, across the sprouting fields, through the woods. He had a way of blending with the landscape as though he lived within it, not on it. Snowling, the pet albino crow he'd rescued from other crows when it was a fledgling, would ride along on his slightly bent shoulders and converse with him in a language I couldn't understand. But Uncle Peter seemed to know perfectly well. "What mystery shall we show Branwyn today?" Uncle Peter would ask Snowling, who would peck his lip gently and make soft, uncrow-like noises in her throat. "The tadpoles, did you say?" And off we'd go to a small pond behind the barn to gaze at the wigglers in the water in their various stages of development until they were full-grown frogs. Or perhaps it would be a cocoon hatching a lovely monarch, a baby robin bursting out of its sky-blue prison, the woven perfection of an oriole's nest, or the excitement of a cow having her calf, or a mare dropping her foal. On cool days in the variable Wisconsin summer, we'd explore the fields, jade and amber, with ripening corn, barley, and oats. There were the lithe little gophers popping in and out of their burrows, and harmless green garter snakes that slithered noiselessly away at our approach, although sometimes Uncle Peter would catch one and stroke it gently until it lay calm and charmed in his hand. Then he would let me pet it until our mutual fear was gone, the snake's and mine, and I could take it into my own hands and know it was not the repulsive, slimy creature I had imagined it to be. Then my uncle would make me look at the grains individually, and I learned the beauty of them, the oriental grace of a spray of oats, like a miniature tree of life, the iridescence of the silken tail of a blade of barley, and the bold, coarse symmetry of a stalk of corn, flaunting its tasseled pregnancy. But when the winds would turn to the southwest, driving the temperature up into the 90s or even the hundreds, then Uncle Peter would welcome the excuse to take me down to the tree-shaded banks of the Serpentine River that scalloped one of the borders of the farm. There we'd skip rocks across the water or venture out in the leaky wooden canoe that would ship water up to the gunwales and still remain afloat, but thoroughly unwieldy until we'd pull her into shore, roll her over to disgorge the river, then start out again. Squirrels darted up and down the trunks of trees and were tame to our presence, because Uncle Peter always brought a store of nuts for them. They would even feed from my hand, although I protested vigorously the day one bit my finger. "Couldn't tell you from the nut," my uncle teased me, feeding a morsel to Snowling. He couldn't charm all creatures, however, especially the neighbor's bull, which took vigorous exception when we cut through his pasture one day. He held his peace until we were halfway across, then lowered his head, dug his hoofs into the turf, and came for us. We made a mad dash for the fence, snowing, circling excitedly above our heads, and making little futile passes at the bull. As we reached the barbed wire, Uncle Peter picked me up and threw me over, then tried to vault the fence. He made it, but his overalls didn't, and he had to hold the seat of them closed all the way home. A lot of tomfool playing around, Aunt Megan muttered, but the corners of her mouth curved. Rhiannon had always scorned our adventures, especially since she'd had Arbeth. Now she was training the mare for another horse show. Come see if the killdeer eggs have hatched, I pleaded with her one day that last summer. Uncle Peter says he knows where there's a nest of new bunnies, too. So what's so interesting about eggs and bunnies, she asked, scornfully. Swinging herself up into the saddle, they happen all the time. She brought her riding crop down across Arbeth's rump, and they cantered away, leaving dust in my face. The bunnies squirmed lazily in their fur-lined nest. There'll be more fun after they get their eyes open, my uncle commented. Let's go see about the killdeers. My guess is that they're about ready to hatch, and if they are, we might miss them. Why? Because killdeers are miniature adults when they hatch, and as soon as their natal down dries, they start fending for themselves and disappear into the grasses. The big event had just taken place, for when we arrived, 3 fluffy gray youngsters lay blinking in the sunlight, and a fourth was just emerging from its dark gray, granite-colored shell. Mother Kildare had hopped off the nest at our approach and was going through her plover ritual of trying to decoy us away, uttering piteous cries, dragging a broken wing and spreading her tail to reveal dawn-colored petticoats. How do they ever survive in these nests on the ground when anything could get at them? I said wonderingly. Mainly by their own cunning, Uncle Peter answered. See, here comes Papa Kildare to assist. He'll try to draw us in another direction, but if we continue to be a threat, he might even attack. But this time all the efforts of the senior Kildares were in vain, for just then Rhiannon came vaulting Arbeth over the hedge, bordering the field. One flying hoof crushed the nest and the quivering babies in it into a bloody horror. Snowling, starting up from my uncle's shoulder in alarm, got caught in the reins and fell to the ground, her neck broken. To this day, I can see the pain in my uncle's eyes as he stared at the mess. And for once, I think he would have taken a strap to Rhiannon. How I hoped he would, if my aunt hadn't intervened. The idea of blaming Rhiannon for what was obviously an accident, Aunt Megan snorted. Her winning a ribbon in the horse show is a lot more important than a few birds. The parents will just lay more eggs and forget all about these. Rhiannon smirked in the shelter of her mother's defense, and yet I don't believe she ever returned Aunt Megan's love. She seldom showed her affection and was often impatient with her, treating her mother as if she were sort of a drab. With Uncle Peter it was different. She was always trying to impress him with something she had baked for him, or some new way she did her hair, and how she could maneuver him. But for all that, he was his own man, and she knew that there was a part of his world she could never penetrate. This only made him all the more attractive to her, and her all the more jealous, not only of me, but of any attention he paid her mother. She was constantly downgrading her mother to him, but either Aunt Megan was stupid or she bore her daughter's contempt in silence. The kitten cost me dear in those next 2 weeks. Rhiannon saw to that. I named it Percival, having just discovered King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and I thought myself altogether clever to have concocted such a pun. Rhiannon scoffed at the name, echoing it mockingly every time I used it until she almost spoiled it for me. But then, no matter what I called the kitten, she would have made fun of it. Uncle Peter took me fishing one day without asking the others to go along, since they both hated the sport. Besides, I think he was tacitly punishing Rhiannon for the kildares and snowling. However, it was a tactical mistake. Aunt Megan grumbled about things needing to be done on the farm, while Rhiannon pouted and gave me dirty looks. Nevertheless, my uncle insisted he didn't need to hold hands with the corn to make it grow. And one day out of the summer wouldn't make that much difference. And besides, I should have some fun during my visit. Hot, muggy weather had crept out of the western plains and settled down on us, so it was with infinite relief that we sat in the shade of the butternut and willow trees that followed the convolutions of the river. We were after bullheads, and I was glad Uncle Peter had brought along beefsteak for bait instead of the rotten Limburger cheese he'd experimented with last year. Someone had told him that bullheads love stinky cheese, so he'd gone to a cheese factory on the edge of town and gotten some of their spoiled Limburger, which we wrapped in small pieces of cheesecloth and dangled in the water. Luckily, the local bullheads had not turned out to be cheese epicures, so he'd gone back to beef. In this heat, the stench would have been unbearable. Not that the effectiveness of the bait mattered much. The main idea was not to catch fish, but to be fishing. Our fun was dampened anyway, now that Snowling was not with us. I dabbled my feet in the water and leaned back against the willow trunk, munching some lemony sheep sorrel. Uncle Peter stuck his pole into the riverbank and promptly snoozed against another tree. Dragonflies hovered above the shimmering surface of the sluggish water, while myriads of tiny creatures went about their humming lives around us. I viewed the world through slitted lids. Lids. I viewed the world through slitted lids. Reality receding from me. Fairy knights rode the dragonfly horses in a splendid tournament. Their squires were the silly water bugs that hopped aimlessly about, much to the amusement of the fairy court, which sat under a canopy of fern. A katydid orchestra, still groggy from its concert the night before, half-heartedly turned its instruments, ready in itself to strike up God Save the Queen, or whatever their national anthem is. The nightly company loomed larger and larger as I felt myself shrinking to be one with them. My pole was nearly jerked out of my hand. Instinctively, I pulled back. A huge bullhead came catapulting out of the water and landed by my side. It wasn't even hooked, just had a tooth hold on the meat. Uncle Peter roused and pounced on the fish, which was flopping around, trying to find its way back to the water. It slipped out of his grasp, and I made a lunge. A searing pain wrenched through my left hand. The bullhead had made good use of one of his barbels. Blood spurted wildly, and my uncle forgot the fish while he tended to my hand. In the meantime, the bullhead slithered off the muddy bank back into the water. We returned home with no trophies and one lacerated hand, which Aunt Megan doctored grimly, relating her own troubles with Percival. It seems that someone, maybe accidentally or maybe not, shut the kitten in the broom closet, and by the time he was let out, many hours later, nature had taken its course. Aunt Megan wiped up the puddle with a dish towel, rinsed it out slightly, and hung it over the back of a chair to dry before putting it in the dirty wash. Rhiannon made much of the incident when we got back, but no one told me which towel had been used, and I had no way of knowing it had been replaced on the rack, and that's where I took it from, even though Rhiannon insisted it was still on the chair. It was my turn to do the dishes, and just as I was drying the last one, Rhiannon came into the kitchen. I told you not to use the red check towel, she scolded. But she hadn't, and I was positive the towel had been on the rack too. I'd bet my life on who slyly replaced it there. But the upshot was that I had to redo the dishes while Rhiannon sat in her room and read movie magazines, or maybe she was polishing her fingernails and fooling around with makeup and hairspray. She had all sorts of intriguing things in jars and tubes that she bought on the sly, but she wouldn't let me share in her rituals because she said I was too young. What good would makeup do you? She smirked at me on one occasion. Her lips smeared a furious red, her lids blue with eyeshadow. Look at you. Your shirt tail hanging out of your jeans as usual, and your braids have wisps sticking out all over. Why don't you comb your hair once in a while? I do, I protested, but it gets loose anyway. Well, I don't suppose you can help being naturally sloppy, she conceded, any more than you can help having a cowlick or blue eyes for that matter. What's wrong with my eyes? I flared indignantly. Blue eyes are so ordinary. There's no point in accentuating them. Now mine are like emeralds. That wasn't quite true. They were much paler than emeralds, like the new washed green of a lake at sunset after a rain, and they were fascinating eyes. Rhiannon was beautiful and capable, and I hated her for both. All right, that's going to be the end of this first half of chapter 3, since I still have, I believe, 12 to 14 pages left, and I'm already 30 minutes into this. So, yeah, there's 12, 13 more pages, whatever. All right. Goodbye, bruv. Goodbye.